Fred Inglis. He's Professor of Cultural History at the University of Warwick. Justine, you might know him, is scathing in his condemnation not only of these reports and the strength of external governmental forces that they represent, but equally, and I think this is as interesting, about the enemies within, who, he argues, are beginning to dictate the limits and direction of the university's distinctive products, namely research, graduates, and it follows doctoral postgraduates, and whose only function, he contends, is reduced to benefiting the economy, a term left as usual in unexampled opacity. A passive, accepting university elite is described in less than flattering terms as the march of the morons, amongst whose numbers he describes as the managerialist undead, presently dancing on spreadsheets before arranging the redundancies of junior staff paid a sixth of their own salaries. In equally emotive terms, a rigged market for higher education is predicted that will confer and confirm privilege among the privileged, he argues, and ensure the control of demand and supply of students and research. The contrast between this discourse and the optimistic and directive top-down emails currently being circulated by senior academic and managerial elites throughout the HE sector in this country could scarcely be greater. In less emotive but research-centred terms, Holligan et al. This year shed light on aspects of changing university cultures most likely to impact upon research, and it follows the likely context in which doctoral education might ensue. And so for today's purposes, my particular interest is in education departments, as these are the most likely arena in which doctorates in EA are sought. Increasingly, of course, business schools are another. But I would argue that broad delineations mask other kind of complexities. Education departments, however, are notable because historically the research identities and culture of staff and students have been shaped by teaching as well as, or more than, by research. Now, this is not to underestimate inter-university and interdepartmental variations, not least in relation to the different practices and purposes of pre- and post-1992 universities in the UK. These extend, however, to what does and should constitute the kinds of education research to be undertaken, whether by doctoral students or staff who supervise them, and opportunities for staff to conduct research. Hazelcorn refers to basic, applied and strategic research. I'm sure you're familiar with these terms, but just very briefly to recap, basic accords with the creation of knowledge for its own sake, in line with Humboldtian models of early 19th century liberal education. Applied to more vocationally orientated education, unsurprisingly a feature of many post-1992 universities, for example, and strategic as research more directly linked with government priorities. Now, the latter has grown throughout the university sector, not surprisingly, since governments either directly or indirectly fund most research. Yet I think it's interesting that whilst earlier government reports in England, for example, called for more diversity in research outputs, and therefore one would imagine what doctoral students do, in reality, the emphasis in previous research assessment exercises, as indeed for Ref 2014, is still firmly aligned with the traditions of basic research of the highest quality, as evidenced on the basis of publications in highly rated peer-reviewed journals. Now, it seems to me that post-1992 institutions have been especially vulnerable to research exclusions, especially when staff face heavy teaching and administrative workloads, within university departments, staff are increasingly categorised as research active or research passive. Henkel previously describing this as a vehicle for professional and personal humiliation, and Morley more recently describing the trend as a coercive productivity. A split focusing between teaching and research, it is suggested, then will have rather different repercussions for those involved in doctoral education. The consequences, positive and negative, for students supervised by the most successful researchers who have become circulating elites, where staff with limited publishing research experience, perhaps because they were recruited for reasons of professional expertise rather than research acumen, often in the absence of a research apprenticeship that completing one's own doctorate in research full environments provides, are simultaneously teaching and supervising students on, as Holligan and Tal evidences, master's degrees and the professional doctorate in education, the Ed.D., with a commitment to impacting on professional practice and school improvements. I'd also want to argue that for such departments, the diverting of government resources towards other organisations, like, for example, the National College for Leadership of Schools and Children's Services, formerly NCSL, places additional competitive pressures on staff to consider the extent to which the doctoral education they offer is or ought to be distinctive, and in which respects, or emulative. For some universities in England and Scotland, for example, decisions have already been made to focus their offer on full-time overseas students instead. So on to knowledge production, next stage. Ronald Barnett has discussed at length the changing role of university academics in the production and circulation of knowledge, and it follows their interactions with research students supervised by them. In a confidently modern world, he asserts, academics took it for granted that there was a world to know, and that their main role was to produce methodologies for knowing the world in more secure ways. In late modernity, or early post-modernity, depending upon one's viewpoint, academics, he asserts, have lost their monopoly over the production of high-status knowledge. Many others outside academe have become what he calls practicing epistemologists, and I would argue this is profoundly the case in the EA field. For the academic, at least 3 new roles have ensued. First, as a problem solver in the grand style, where the academic has to offer solutions to given problems. Second, as an endorser of state policies, where the problems and the solutions have been determined in advance, and the academic fills in the detail, providing evaluations and performance indicators to plug the gap and ensure predetermined outcomes. Or third, they become postmodernist cultural voyeurs who eschew all grand narratives and follow all. This might lead us to ask, where and how do these roles interlink with original and critical thought, analysis and activity, traditionally deemed as the essence of the academic being, whether one is a student or a member of staff? Barnett argues that in all 3 cases, some critical elements are present, but in very limited forms. For problem solvers, for example, it is conceivable that academics might be able to refashion problems critically so that others might see them in different, more innovative ways. For endorsers, even more narrowly circumscribed forms of critical thinking occur when new kinds of manager and new kinds of roles and responsibilities are advocated and insisted upon. Endorsers' allegiance to surveillance techniques and concerns for bottom line outcomes